Chaos Before the Storm by Kyle Byram. Chapter 1. Nathan Carter stirred in the suffocating grip of dawn's first light. The pale glow seeped through the cracks in the blinds, illuminating the disarray of his room, a battlefield of discarded pill bottles, crumpled therapy handouts, and coffee-stained notebooks filled with nonsensical scribbles. The whispers had already started, serpentine murmurs winding through his consciousness before he could muster the strength to open his eyes. "You won't make it through today," the voice hissed, an ominous rasp that seemed to reverberate within the marrow of his bones. Nathan inhaled sharply, his chest tightening as though an unseen hand had seized his ribs. He sat upright, his sheets damp with the cold sweat of restless nights. The whispers were his perennial tormentors, arriving with cruel punctuality each morning. They were as much a part of his existence as his heartbeat, relentless and involuntary. Fumbling for his glasses on the cluttered nightstand, Nathan's trembling fingers brushed against the orange bottle of antipsychotics. The label's ink had faded, smudged by time and desperation, but he didn't need to read it. The pills, chalky and bitter, were his only tether to a semblance of clarity. "Take them," a voice urged. This one was soothing, measured, a voice he had come to know as Gabriel. Gabriel's tone was like a lighthouse in a storm, offering fleeting moments of direction in a chaotic sea. But before Nathan could obey, another voice interjected, venomous and mocking. "Don't bother, you coward! Do you really think swallowing those will make us go away? Damien!" Nathan's pulse quickened as the two voices collided, a cacophony that filled the small room. He clenched his jaw, gripping the bottle so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Leave me alone," he whispered, though his words lacked conviction. The room responded with silence, but it wasn't a silence born of peace. It was heavy, oppressive, teeming with the presence of unseen specters. Nathan could feel their eyes on him, or rather, the eyes of his fractured psyche. They lurked just beyond his perception, waiting, watching, calculating their next move. Dragging himself from the bed, he shuffled toward the window. The city stretched before him, a sprawling labyrinth of noise and light. Yet, for all its chaos, Nathan felt utterly alone. To the outside world, he was just another man, a shadow among shadows, unnoticed and unremarkable. But inside his mind, a war raged, an endless battle he could neither escape nor win. He stared at his reflection in the windowpane, his face gaunt and hollow. The eyes that stared back at him weren't his own, or perhaps they were but distorted by years of torment. He touched the glass, half expecting the reflection to flinch, to recoil from the truth it couldn't hide. "You can't keep this up," Vincent's voice chimed in, clinical and detached. "You're deteriorating. It's only a matter of time before you crack entirely." Nathan smirked bitterly, the kind of smile that tasted of despair. "And what then?" he murmured. "What happens when I crack?" The reply was immediate and chilling, delivered in a whisper that wasn't quite human. "Then you'll see us for what we truly are." Chapter 2. Gabriel's presence was the only one Nathan could endure without his heart sinking into the abyss. While the others clawed at his sanity with barbs of derision or mockery, Gabriel's voice was gentle, deliberate, and calm, like an anchor in turbulent waters. Yet, even his kindness carried a tinge of sorrow, as though he bore the weight of Nathan's suffering alongside him. "Today," Gabriel spoke softly, his words threading through the noise in Nathan's mind like a hymn. "The sun is shining today. Open the blinds, Nathan. Let it in." Nathan hesitated, his hands hovering over the dusty slats of the window blinds. "It's a trap," Damien growled, but Gabriel's voice overpowered him, cutting through the darkness like a blade. "Trust me." Nathan exhaled and drew the blinds aside. Light poured into the room, golden and warm, illuminating the ruins of his life in unforgiving clarity. The sight of the cluttered room filled him with a strange mix of shame and relief. Gabriel had a way of persuading him to confront reality without drowning in it. "You're the only one who makes sense," Nathan muttered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "That's because I'm here to help," Gabriel replied. "Let's get you moving. Start with the small things. Clear the desk." The desk was a graveyard of unfinished projects, a sketchbook filled with disjointed images of fractured faces and stormy skies, a journal half written in ink and half in pencil, and loose pages scrawled with words that no longer made sense to him. As he stacked the papers, a small photograph slipped free and fluttered to the floor. Nathan bent to pick it up, his breath hitching as his fingers brushed the image. It was of him and his sister, Anna, standing beside the fountain in the park where they used to play. He looked impossibly young, his face unmarked by the wear of years and madness. Anna's smile was radiant, her arm slung over his shoulder with the ease of unconditional love. "What would she think of me now?" he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of guilt. Gabriel's reply was immediate, comforting. "She would understand. She always did. You're still her brother, Nathan. That hasn't changed." The photograph shook in his trembling hand. The others began to stir, their voices rising like a swarm of locusts. "Liar," Damien spat. "She wouldn't even recognize him now. Look at him, pathetic, broken. He could fix himself, if he wasn't so weak," Vincent added coldly. The chaos roared in Nathan's head, but Gabriel's voice surged like a beacon. "Focus on me. Just me. They're only fragments, they can't hurt you." Nathan clung to those words, even as the onslaught of insults and accusations threatened to drown him. He forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady, and began clearing the desk. The act felt monumental, as though he were moving mountains instead of papers and pins. As the desk emerged from beneath the clutter, Nathan felt a flicker of accomplishment. It wasn't much, but it was something, a moment of clarity in the storm. "You did well," Gabriel said softly. "One step at a time. That's how we'll get through this." Nathan's lips twitched in a semblance of a smile. Gabriel was right, he always was. But as he turned to face the rest of the room, the enormity of the task ahead loomed like a shadow. "One step at a time," Gabriel had said. But what if there were too many steps, too many shadows? And what if Gabriel wasn't there to guide him? Chapter 3. The air grew heavier when Damien came to the fore, like the atmosphere thickened with smoke and ash. Damien was the tempest Nathan feared most, a voice of unrelenting cruelty, a force that tore through his psyche with a ferocity that left him raw and trembling. Damien was everything Nathan despised about himself amplified to a deafening roar. He was the self-loathing, the biting cynicism, the venomous doubts that never truly left Nathan alone. The day had started quietly enough, with Gabriel's reassuring presence shepherding Nathan through a mundane breakfast. But as the hours crawled by, an argument began to brew inside his head, and Damien emerged, his voice acidic and mocking. "Gabriel coddles you like a child," Damien sneered. "He tells you everything will be okay, but look around, Nathan. You're a failure, a disgrace. He's lying to you." Nathan froze, the cereal spoon clattering against the edge of his bowl. His hands trembled as the voice swelled, growing louder and more oppressive. "You think you can fix yourself?" Damien pressed, laughing cruelly. "You couldn't even fix a simple life. You're a parasite, leeching off pity. Gabriel's wasting his breath on you." "Shut up," Nathan whispered, clutching his temples. The room seemed to tilt, the edges of his vision blurring. But Damien was relentless. "Go ahead, tell me I'm wrong. Prove me wrong. Oh wait, you can't. You've never been able to stand on your own 2 feet." The onslaught became physical, a visceral sensation that clawed at his insides. Nathan staggered to his feet, knocking over the chair as he moved to the kitchen sink. The faucet groaned as he twisted it open, and he splashed cold water onto his face in an attempt to quell the burning rage within. "You think that'll help?" Damien mocked, his tone biting. "You're pathetic." Nathan gripped the edge of the sink, his knuckles white. He wanted to scream, to purge Damien from his mind entirely, but he knew it would do no good. Damien wasn't external, he was a part of him, a manifestation of everything he hated and feared. And Damien thrived on chaos. "Face it, Nathan," Damien hissed. "You'd be better off ending this farce. Do everyone a favor and disappear." The words struck like a physical blow, and Nathan doubled over, gasping for air. Tears streamed down his face, hot and unchecked. He felt Damien's presence recede slightly, but the damage had been done. Exhausted, Nathan slumped to the floor, his back against the cabinet. The cold tile beneath him was the only thing tethering him to reality. The cacophony in his head had dimmed to a murmur, but Damien's words echoed in the silence like a poisonous refrain. As Nathan sat there, his body shaking and his mind fractured, he felt the crushing weight of despair settle over him. Damien's voice might have retreated, but it was never truly gone. It lingered in the shadows, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. He closed his eyes, longing for a reprieve, but the chaos within offered no solace. Each breath felt like a battle, each moment a trial. And as the day dragged on, Nathan knew that Damien's inferno would flare again, consuming him from the inside out. Chapter 4. Vincent entered Nathan's mind like a shadow slipping through the cracks in the dark. Unlike Damien, whose presence was abrasive, loud, and violent, Vincent was subtle, deceptive in his gentleness. He was a charmer, a manipulator, and in some sickening way, Nathan found himself oddly drawn to his presence. Where Damien's cruelty felt like a fist to the face, Vincent was the poison in the wine, quiet and smooth, slowly unraveling Nathan's resolve, one delicate thread at a time. It was late afternoon when Vincent surfaced, taking the quiet void left by Damien's departure and replacing it with a languid calm. Nathan, once again, found himself staring at the blank wall of his bedroom. The hum of the fluorescent light above was the only sound, a monotonous buzz that seemed to vibrate in tune with his nerves. He could feel the creeping pull of Vincent, gentle, coaxing, persuasive. "What's the harm in taking a break?" Vincent's voice was soft, like silk slipping across his consciousness. "You've been through a lot. You deserve peace. Don't fight it." Nathan shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping the armrest of the chair as if to ward off the voice, but Vincent was insidious, his words seductive and laced with promise. "You've tried everything, haven't you? The therapy, the medication, the coping mechanisms. And yet, here you are. Still broken." Nathan's chest tightened. The whisper became a subtle beckoning, urging him to give in, to stop resisting. Vincent understood the way Nathan's mind worked, how his fragility could be twisted, how his deepest insecurities could be turned into chains that bound him tighter with every word. "What's the point of all this struggle?" Vincent continued, his tone smooth as oil. "You've already lost. You can feel it, can't you? The emptiness. The isolation. They all see you as weak, don't they? Gabriel, the doctors, even your own family. You're a burden to them. It's time to stop pretending. Stop pretending you're okay. You'll only disappoint them more, in the end." Nathan's head swam with the sickening truth in Vincent's words. He had been fighting this battle for so long, and still, there was no relief. Vincent was right in so many ways. He could feel his body sagging, his will weakening. The effort to maintain the semblance of normalcy had become so exhausting. And in Vincent's soothing, almost empathetic tone, Nathan found himself clinging to the lie that it might be easier to give in. "You think they care about you? You think Gabriel can fix you?" Vincent pressed. "He's just another person trying to save you so he can feel better about himself. But he can't. No one can." Nathan curled his hands into fists, his nails digging into the soft flesh of his palms. His head throbbed with a dull ache, and for a moment, he almost wished Vincent's words were true. The exhaustion weighed heavily on him, the suffocating sense that nothing would ever change. "Stop fighting," Vincent murmured, as if sensing the shift in Nathan's resolve. "Let it all go. Accept it." But then, just as quickly as he appeared, Vincent's voice withdrew, leaving Nathan alone with his thoughts, those dark, spiraling thoughts that had no end. Nathan's vision blurred, and the tears began to well again, but they were not from sorrow. They were from a profound weariness. Gabriel had been right about one thing: Nathan had been trying to fix himself for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to simply let go. To stop trying. As the night drew on, Vincent's subtle influence faded, replaced by a heavy silence, but Nathan knew the worst was yet to come. Each personality brought with it its own weight, its own manipulative hand, but Vincent was always the one that played on Nathan's weakest, most vulnerable moments, the ones where even hope seemed like a fool's errand. And Nathan, more often than not, found himself questioning whether Vincent's words might not hold a sinister truth. What was the point of fighting anymore? Wouldn't it be better to just stop? As his mind spiraled into the abyss once again, Nathan realized that this, the calm, calculated persuasion, was just another form of torment. A deeper form of violence, wrapped in the guise of concern. Chapter 5. Helen's presence was unlike the others, more subtle, yet equally as invasive. Where Vincent had woven his webs of manipulation with quiet eloquence, Helen simply knew. Her voice did not coax or persuade, it simply stated what was to be. It was a voice of inevitability, like the press of a cold hand against Nathan's chest, the weight of something that could not be ignored. Helen didn't speak in long phrases, as Damien or Vincent did. No, Helen's words were sharp, cutting through the thick fog of Nathan's consciousness like a blade. She was the embodiment of his deepest fears, his most repressed anxieties, and the relentless ticking clock of a life spiraling into chaos. It was another sleepless night, the kind that stretched on without mercy, each passing minute a small eternity of torment. Nathan sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a half-empty mug of cold coffee that had long lost its warmth. The shadows in the room seemed to gather around him, thick and impenetrable. His head throbbed incessantly, a dull, pounding ache that reverberated through his skull, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He had tried to distract himself, tried to focus on the trivial, the mundane, but the quiet was too heavy. The silence too loud. You'll never escape this. The words were sudden, cutting through the stillness of the room like a splinter lodged deep into his mind. Helen's voice, low and matter-of-fact, never asked for permission to invade. It just was. You think you can outrun it? She continued, her voice rich with disdain, as if she knew him better than he knew himself. You think you can keep up this facade forever? Nathan flinched, his heart sinking. This was the voice that haunted him, the voice of self-doubt and despair, the one that told him there was no way out, no hope, no redemption. He squeezed his eyes shut, as if trying to force the voice out, but it was no use. Helen was there, sitting next to him in the dark, her presence suffocating him like a thick fog that he couldn't escape. They all know, she said, her voice dripping with cold certainty. They all see what you really are. No one wants to deal with you. No one wants to help you. You're a burden, Nathan. You always have been. Her words sliced through the air like shards of glass, each one cutting deeper than the last. Nathan felt the familiar weight of shame settle over him. He had always known, on some level, that people saw him as a liability. That Gabriel's attempts to fix him were nothing more than charity, born from some misplaced sense of duty. But hearing Helen say it so bluntly, so coldly, made it all feel so real, so undeniable. Don't bother trying to reach out. They'll never understand. Helen's voice was relentless now, suffused with an almost mocking tone. They'll say the right things. They'll nod, smile, pretend. But in the end, it's you. It's always you. You're the problem. Nathan's fingers tightened around the mug, his knuckles turning white. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. There was a quiet madness to her words, something almost hypnotic in the way they slid through his mind, wrapping themselves around his thoughts like chains. You're all alone, Helen whispered, as if it were the most natural fact in the world. And you always will be. Nathan shuddered at the finality in her tone. He didn't want to believe her, but a small, dangerous part of him did. The isolation, the alienation, the endless hours of trying to hold it all together, it was wearing him down. And as Helen's words echoed in his mind, they seemed to take root, growing like weeds in the dark corners of his consciousness. She was right. He was alone. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing closer, the air becoming thick and heavy. Nathan dropped the mug, the porcelain shattering on the cold tile floor. But the sound barely registered, drowned out by the overwhelming flood of thoughts that Helen had unleashed within him. You're never going to escape it, Helen whispered, her voice now a soothing lullaby, comforting in its bleak inevitability. So why keep fighting? Why keep pretending to be something you're not? Nathan's hands trembled at his sides, his mind spinning. The despair was crushing him, suffocating him. Helen's presence was overwhelming, and for a moment, it felt as though there was no way out, no escape from the mental labyrinth she had ensnared him in. "Let it go," she murmured. "Let go of the fight. Let go of the hope. Just rest." The suggestion, though quiet, felt almost like a command. It was the first time in a long time that Nathan had heard anything that sounded like peace, but it was the kind of peace that came from surrender. The peace of giving up. For a moment, Nathan sat there, breathing heavily, caught between the pull of Helen's voice and the reality of what it meant. To give in. To stop trying. To accept the life that had been handed to him, with all its pain and isolation. But as he gazed into the shattered remains of the mug on the floor, something shifted inside him. A sudden, fierce surge of defiance. "No," he whispered to himself, shaking his head. I'm not done yet." Helen's voice faded into the background as Nathan clung to the fragile thread of resistance that remained. He had no idea how long he could hold on to it, but for now, it was enough to stave off the suffocating darkness that Helen had tried to wrap around him. But as the night dragged on, Nathan knew that it would only be a matter of time before Helen, too, would return, her whispers slipping into the cracks in his sanity, her voice ever present, pushing him closer to the edge. Chapter 6. Vincent was not like the others. Where Helen had been the embodiment of despair, where Damien had been chaos itself, Vincent was calculated, manipulative, and cold. He didn't speak in loud, jarring outbursts, nor did he press Nathan down with the weight of his own shame. Vincent was the type to slowly twist the knife, turning it with precision, allowing every word to sink into Nathan's psyche like poison, leaving him to stew in his own toxic thoughts. Vincent was a master of subtlety. His voice was low, smooth, and laced with a veneer of concern that Nathan knew all too well to distrust. Every word he spoke was delivered with a practiced ease, a kind of charm that disarmed all of Nathan's defenses. He never yelled, never raised his voice. He simply suggested. Nathan had been walking through the park, a place that once held memories of peace and solitude. Now, it felt like a prison. The trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their bare branches stretching out as if to ensnare him. The wind bit at his skin, and the chill of the air seeped into his bones. But it wasn't the cold that made his stomach churn, it was the suffocating presence of Vincent, lurking just behind the veil of his consciousness. "You're wasting your time," Vincent's voice whispered, as smooth as velvet, curling around Nathan's thoughts like smoke. "You know this is pointless. All of it." Nathan's footsteps faltered, his head snapping around as if expecting to see Vincent standing there, his tall frame draped in darkness. But no one was there. The park was empty, silent except for the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant bark of a dog. Yet, the voice was unmistakable. "You think anyone cares, don't you? You think anyone is going to help you? But they're all just waiting for you to fail." Nathan gritted his teeth, pressing his hands to his ears in an attempt to block out the voice. But Vincent's words were insidious, slithering past his defenses with ease. "You really think Gabriel is your friend?" Vincent continued, his tone so smooth, so convincing. "He's just biding his time, waiting for the moment when he can cut you loose. When he can walk away and never look back." Nathan's heart clenched. The thought had crossed his mind before, Gabriel's pity, his sympathy, was it real? Or had he been a project, a charity case to pass the time until something better came along? "He'll get bored with you, Nathan. He already has." The words hit harder than any of Vincent's previous attacks. The idea that Gabriel, the one person who had tried to reach out, had actually been faking it. It made Nathan feel small, insignificant. It wasn't that he had ever really trusted Gabriel, he couldn't. The idea of trusting anyone had long since been discarded. But the thought that Gabriel might be pretending to care was an unbearable weight pressing down on him. "You don't matter to him," Vincent whispered, his voice so soft it could have been mistaken for a mere breeze. "You're a burden, a thing to tolerate until he's had enough. Then, you'll be discarded. Forgotten." Nathan stopped walking, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He felt his legs weaken beneath him, his body threatening to give way. Vincent's voice was a balm to his doubts, soothing the fears that had been gnawing at him. The truth, as Vincent spoke it, felt comforting in its finality. "You should be grateful," Vincent continued, his tone gentle now, almost affectionate. At least someone is still giving you the time of day. They tolerate you. They take care of you. What more could you ask for? Nathan's mind spun, his thoughts clashing with the harsh words that had been poured into him. Could it be true? Could Gabriel have been pretending all along? Was he merely some experiment, some wayward soul that had piqued his interest? Vincent's grip on his thoughts tightened, the words becoming more insistent. You're lucky. You're lucky he's still around, waiting to drop you the moment you stop being convenient. The pain of those words was too much. Nathan stumbled back, leaning against the cold bark of a nearby tree for support. His head was spinning, and the fog of confusion threatened to overwhelm him. His thoughts were a labyrinth, spiraling deeper into uncertainty. He had never trusted anyone completely, but now, even that small shred of trust he had in Gabriel was being eroded away by Vincent's poison. You're a fool if you think they care about you, Vincent crooned, almost purring now. You're a fool if you think they ever will. Nathan gripped the bark of the tree harder, his fingers digging into the rough texture, as if trying to anchor himself. But there was no escaping Vincent. He was in every corner of Nathan's mind, every shadow in his thoughts. He could never escape him. It's okay, Vincent said, his voice soft and soothing, as if he were comforting a child. You don't need them. You don't need anyone. You can survive on your own. You can be your own savior. The words were like a balm, a deceptive comfort. Nathan felt the familiar weight of despair settle over him, a sense of emptiness growing inside him like a void. He had always believed, deep down, that he was worthless, that no one truly cared for him. Vincent's words only reaffirmed the beliefs he had hidden in the deepest, darkest parts of his soul. For a moment, there was a flicker of something. A thought, an idea, a realization. Vincent's voice wasn't just a suggestion, it was a demand. A demand to give up, to let go, to accept that life was nothing but a string of fleeting moments until it all came crashing down. And for the briefest moment, Nathan thought about it, thought about walking away, about letting the silence take him. But then, as quickly as the thought appeared, it was gone. The world around him felt sharp and distant, as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground below him crumbling into nothingness. He wasn't ready to fall. But the feeling of Vincent's presence lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that Vincent was right. That he was just a temporary fixture in the world, a thing to be tolerated until he became too much of a burden. It's all so simple, Vincent murmured, as if reading Nathan's thoughts. Just let go. Just let them go. Let them leave you behind. Nathan closed his eyes, the weight of the words sinking deep into his chest. He was alone. Always alone. The voices, each one different, each one relentless, would never leave him. And, in the end, he wasn't sure he wanted them to. Chapter 6. Vincent was not like the others. Where Helen had been the embodiment of despair, where Damien had been chaos itself, Vincent was calculated, manipulative, and cold. He didn't speak in loud, jarring outbursts, nor did he press Nathan down with the weight of his own shame. Vincent was the type to slowly twist the knife, turning it with precision, allowing every word to sink into Nathan's psyche like poison, leaving him to stew in his own toxic thoughts. Vincent was a master of subtlety. His voice was low, smooth, and laced with a veneer of concern that Nathan knew all too well to distrust. Every word he spoke was delivered with a practiced ease, a kind of charm that disarmed all of Nathan's defenses. He never yelled, never raised his voice. He simply suggested. Nathan had been walking through the park, a place that once held memories of peace and solitude. Now, it felt like a prison. The trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their bare branches stretching out as if to ensnare him. The wind bit at his skin, and the chill of the air seeped into his bones. But it wasn't the cold that made his stomach churn, it was the suffocating presence of Vincent, lurking just behind the veil of his consciousness. You're wasting your time, Vincent's voice whispered, as smooth as velvet, curling around Nathan's thoughts like smoke. You know this is pointless. All of it. Nathan's footsteps faltered, his head snapping around as if expecting to see Vincent standing there, his tall frame draped in darkness. But no one was there. The park was empty, silent except for the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant bark of a dog. Yet, the voice was unmistakable. You think anyone cares, don't you? You think anyone is going to help you? But they're all just waiting for you to fail. Nathan gritted his teeth, pressing his hands to his ears in an attempt to block out the voice. But Vincent's words were insidious, slithering past his defenses with ease. You really think Gabriel is your friend? Vincent continued, his tone so smooth, so convincing. He's just biding his time, waiting for the moment when he can cut you loose. When he can walk away and never look back. Nathan's heart clenched. The thought had crossed his mind before, Gabriel's pity, his sympathy, was it real? Or had he been a project, a charity case to pass the time until something better came along? He'll get bored with you, Nathan. He already has. The words hit harder than any of Vincent's previous attacks. The idea that Gabriel, the one person who had tried to reach out, had actually been faking it. It made Nathan feel small, insignificant. It wasn't that he had ever really trusted Gabriel, he couldn't. The idea of trusting anyone had long since been discarded. But the thought that Gabriel might be pretending to care was an unbearable weight pressing down on him. You don't matter to him, Vincent whispered, his voice so soft it could have been mistaken for a mere breeze. You're a burden, a thing to tolerate until he's had enough. Then, you'll be discarded. Forgotten. Nathan stopped walking, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He felt his legs weaken beneath him, his body threatening to give way. Vincent's voice was a balm to his doubts, soothing the fears that had been gnawing at him. The truth, as Vincent spoke it, felt comforting in its finality. You should be grateful, Vincent continued, his tone gentle now, almost affectionate. At least someone is still giving you the time of day. They tolerate you. They take care of you. What more could you ask for? Nathan's mind spun, his thoughts clashing with the harsh words that had been poured into him. Could it be true? Could Gabriel have been pretending all along? Was he merely some experiment, some wayward soul that had piqued his interest? Vincent's grip on his thoughts tightened, the words becoming more insistent. You're lucky. You're lucky he's still around, waiting to drop you the moment you stop being convenient. The pain of those words was too much. Nathan stumbled back, leaning against the cold bark of a nearby tree for support. His head was spinning, and the fog of confusion threatened to overwhelm him. His thoughts were a labyrinth, spiraling deeper into uncertainty. He had never trusted anyone completely, but now, even that small shred of trust he had in Gabriel was being eroded away by Vincent's poison. You're a fool if you think they care about you, Vincent crooned, almost purring now. You're a fool if you think they ever will. Nathan gripped the bark of the tree harder, his fingers digging into the rough texture, as if trying to anchor himself. But there was no escaping Vincent. He was in every corner of Nathan's mind, every shadow in his thoughts. He could never escape him. It's okay, Vincent said, his voice soft and soothing, as if he were comforting a child. You don't need them. You don't need anyone. You can survive on your own. You can be your own savior. The words were like a balm, a deceptive comfort. Nathan felt the familiar weight of despair settle over him, a sense of emptiness growing inside him like a void. He had always believed, deep down, that he was worthless, that no one truly cared for him. Vincent's words only reaffirmed the beliefs he had hidden in the deepest, darkest parts of his soul. For a moment, there was a flicker of something. A thought, an idea, a realization. Vincent's voice wasn't just a suggestion, it was a demand. A demand to give up, to let go, to accept that life was nothing but a string of fleeting moments until it all came crashing down. And for the briefest moment, Nathan thought about it, thought about walking away, about letting the silence take him. But then, as quickly as the thought appeared, it was gone. The world around him felt sharp and distant, as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground below him crumbling into nothingness. He wasn't ready to fall. But the feeling of Vincent's presence lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that Vincent was right. That he was just a temporary fixture in the world, a thing to be tolerated until he became too much of a burden. It's all so simple, Vincent murmured, as if reading Nathan's thoughts. Just let go. Just let them go. Let them leave you behind. Nathan closed his eyes, the weight of the words sinking deep into his chest. He was alone. Always alone. The voices, each one different, each one relentless, would never leave him. And, in the end, he wasn't sure he wanted them to. Chapter 7. Nathan stood at the edge of the mirror, his reflection distorted, wavering as if the very glass was reluctant to reveal him. His heartbeat echoed in his chest, loud and insistent, drowning out the quiet whispers that had become more than just a nuisance. They had grown in number, a chorus of voices, each vying for dominance within his fractured mind. Vincent's voice was the loudest, though. It always was. "You're weak, Nathan," he said, his tone as smooth as silk but wrapped in the venom of truth. "You know that, don't you?" Nathan's hands trembled. He clenched them into fists, trying to steady himself. He could see his reflection now, but it wasn't just him. It was Vincent too. A pale figure stood behind him, an exact duplicate of Nathan, except for the eyes, dark and hollow, like black pools with no end. Those eyes stared at him with an unsettling familiarity. "You've always been weak," Vincent continued, his presence wrapping around Nathan like a suffocating cloak. "Everything you've done, every decision, every mistake, it's all because of you. You allowed yourself to be manipulated. By me, by others, by your own weakness." Nathan's breath hitched, and he turned his head sharply. There was no one there. Just him and the reflection. "Stop it," Nathan whispered, his voice thin, barely audible. "You're not real." But the reflection in the glass smiled. "Not real?" Vincent chuckled, a sound that seemed to echo from every corner of the room. "I am as real as you are. Maybe more so. You think you can fight me? You've been fighting me for years, Nathan, but I'm the one who controls you. Every thought, every action, it's all me. I've been here, waiting for you to finally crack. And look at you now." The reflection smirked. Nathan could feel it, could feel the presence of Vincent as if he was standing right behind him. He turned, but nothing was there. "You've been pushing me down, burying me beneath the surface, but I'm always there. I always will be." Vincent's voice was now a hiss, a constant, menacing whisper in Nathan's mind. "Don't you see? You can't escape me. I am you. And you are nothing without me." Nathan's head spun, the room tilting, the walls closing in around him. His vision blurred, and the reflection in the mirror started to distort even further. It was like watching himself unravel, piece by piece. His own body stretched unnaturally, contorting into something monstrous, something vile. "No," he shouted, stepping back. "You're lying! You're lying!" But Vincent's laughter only grew louder, a maddening, suffocating sound that filled every inch of the room. It was no longer just in his head. It was everywhere. The walls vibrated with it. The floor beneath him shook. And then, silence. Nathan collapsed to his knees, his breath ragged, sweat pouring down his face. His mind was spinning, his thoughts a blur. The voices, the reflection, the pressure, everything was too much. He tried to focus, tried to make sense of it all, but Vincent's words gnawed at the edges of his consciousness, relentless and insidious. "You think you're still in control, don't you?" Vincent's voice was soft now, almost comforting. "But you're not. Not anymore." Nathan shut his eyes tightly, trying to shut out the voice, but it was no use. It was inside him now. Vincent had always been inside him. He was the very core of his madness, the dark seed that had taken root long ago. "You don't have to fight anymore, Nathan," Vincent murmured. "You don't have to suffer. Just let go. Let me take over. It'll be so much easier." Nathan's hands, slick with sweat, clutched at the floor, trying to hold on to something, anything, to ground himself. But it was slipping away. His grip was faltering. His mind was failing him. He could feel Vincent pushing against the walls of his sanity, testing them, probing for any weakness. And Nathan, he was weakening. He could feel the weight of it all, the exhaustion, the fear, the despair, and it pressed down on him like a heavy blanket, suffocating him. He wanted to scream, wanted to beg for it to stop, but the words wouldn't come. It was happening! Vincent was winning! "I'll give you peace," Vincent whispered, so close now that Nathan could almost feel the cold breath on the back of his neck. "I'll give you rest. Just let me take over. Just let me end this." Nathan's vision flickered. He saw himself standing there, but it wasn't him anymore. It was Vincent. His face was twisted in a cruel, triumphant grin. And then it hit him. Vincent wasn't just a part of him. Vincent was him. There was no separating them. No escaping. Nathan had been living in Vincent's shadow for so long, but he had never realized, he had never truly understood, that Vincent had been the one in control all along. The realization broke him. His chest tightened. His heart raced. The room began to spin, the edges of his vision growing dim. "You were never in control," Vincent's voice was now a soothing lullaby, gentle, almost kind. "You were always mine." Nathan gasped, his body shaking. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He couldn't fight it anymore. And then, with one final breath, the world went black. Chapter 8. Nathan awoke with a jolt, his body slamming against the cold, unforgiving floor. The shock of it cleared the remnants of sleep from his mind, but it didn't banish the suffocating haze that clung to him like a shroud. The room was dark, too dark. His fingers brushed against the floor, seeking a sense of reality, some anchor to cling to. But there was nothing, nothing but the silence. The silence? It was deafening. It was the kind of silence that clung to the edges of every thought, a silence so complete that it almost felt like the world had stopped turning. He blinked, disoriented, trying to push through the fog in his mind. He wasn't alone. The whisper came again, so soft at first, barely perceptible, like a breath of wind through dead leaves. But then it grew louder, sharper, more insistent. "Nathan! You can't escape!" It was Vincent. His voice. But it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the venomous hiss of control or the soothing lullaby of temptation. It was something else. Something distant. Nathan staggered to his feet, his legs weak beneath him, the floor unsteady. He felt the familiar weight of the world press against him, the cold grip of anxiety and fear tightening around his chest. He didn't look in the mirror this time, he couldn't. But the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as if they were watching him, waiting. "Where are you?" he whispered, his voice raw, strained. "What do you want from me?" The silence stretched longer than it should have. It was a suffocating thing, like waiting for a storm that never came, the air thick with anticipation. Then, the voice returned. It was softer, almost comforting. "You'll find me," it promised, a cold assurance in its tone. "I've always been with you, Nathan. Always." Nathan's heart thudded in his chest, his hands trembling. He closed his eyes, trying to push the noise out, to block out the gnawing pressure that seemed to build up in his mind. He could feel Vincent there, somewhere in the back of his mind, like an ever-present shadow. But something was different this time. The voice, this version of Vincent, was quieter, almost withdrawn, as if the power had shifted. The familiar pull, the urge to surrender to Vincent's control, was still there, but now it felt more like a distant memory. He didn't know how to explain it. He didn't know if he wanted to. Nathan stumbled toward the door, his mind racing. Every step felt like an eternity, each one pulling him deeper into a place he didn't understand. A place where Vincent's influence felt far away, almost unreachable. But that's when it hit him. The emptiness. It wasn't just the silence. It was the complete absence of Vincent's presence, the strange, unsettling void that seemed to swallow him whole. There were no voices now, no whispers in the corners of his mind, no commanding presence. It was just nothing. He froze, his hand hovering just inches from the door. He had been living in chaos for so long, the constant barrage of thoughts and voices never relenting, always overwhelming. But now there was silence. Silence so profound that it felt like his very existence was at stake. "No," he whispered to himself. "This is wrong. This isn't real." The cold weight of panic gripped him. What was happening? The world around him felt unstable, fragile, as though he was walking on the edge of something huge and unknown. A flicker in the darkness. His eyes shot open. His breath quickened. A figure, no, it was him, was standing across the room, staring back at him through the shadows. He could see the reflection of himself in the darkened window, but the image was blurry, shifting, distorted. The figure that stood there looked wrong. It was him, but not him. The face was twisted, as too wide, too empty. The reflection in the window was smiling. Nathan backed away, his heart pounding as he moved towards the opposite wall, his breath shallow, ragged. The image in the window did not move. It stayed frozen, like a mask. "Vincent?" he called, his voice breaking. "What are you doing? What is this?" The silence answered him, a deep, unsettling silence that seemed to swallow his words whole. The figure in the window, his reflection, finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, it raised its hand and pressed it against the glass, the fingers leaving faint trails of condensation. Nathan's throat constricted. He wanted to scream, to shout at it, but his body wouldn't obey. He felt paralyzed, stuck in the moment, caught between a nightmare and a waking reality that no longer made sense. "Why are you doing this?" he whispered again, his voice a ragged rasp. "What do you want?" The reflection did not answer. Instead, it stared at him, unblinking, its expression cold and uncaring. Then, with a jarring crack, the glass shattered, splintering into 1,000 pieces that rained down around him, cutting through the silence like 1,000 knives. And then, in the midst of the chaos, a voice, quieter than before but still sharp, still there. "You're alone now?" The words were final. Unyielding. The reflection was gone, replaced by the shards of glass scattered across the floor, each one reflecting a fragment of the room, a fragment of himself. Nathan's mind spun, unraveling once more, the threads of his reality coming undone in front of his eyes. He staggered back again, his feet stumbling over the shards, the jagged glass cutting through his skin as he walked. He didn't feel the pain, not anymore. The pain had long since become part of the background noise. But the voice, the void of Vincent's control, it felt too close now. He could hear it, still whispering. Still laughing. "You're alone now, Nathan." Nathan's hands trembled as he wiped away the sweat from his forehead. He couldn't breathe, couldn't focus. His thoughts scattered like broken glass. The pressure was building again, the crushing weight of Vincent's absence pushing him further into madness. And with that, the silence returned. The same silence that had started it all. Chapter 9. Nathan's mind refused to stabilize. The silence that had followed the shattering of the mirror was suffocating, unbearable in its vastness. His pulse raced in his ears, the only sound he could register. Each heartbeat felt like a drum of warning, the rhythm growing frantic, desperate. The world around him had no clear shape, just fractured pieces of light and shadow that twisted, stretched, and collided into one another. He couldn't focus on one thing, couldn't grasp what was real, what was a memory, and what was nothing but the fragments of his disintegrating psyche. He pressed his hands to his temples, attempting to block out the rising chaos in his mind. The air in the room had grown thick, oppressive, as though it, too, was holding its breath, waiting for something. He couldn't remember when it had started, this unbearable weight in his chest, but it had been building for what felt like forever. The voices, no, not voices anymore, but echoes, far off, drifting between the cracks of his fractured consciousness, seemed muted, distant. He thought he heard Vincent again, but the voice was no longer full of malice or command. It was a quiet murmur, just beyond reach, like a shadow at the edge of his vision. Was it real? Or was it just a product of his mind, teasing him with an illusion of presence? "You're not real," he muttered, his voice trembling, unsure whether he was addressing the whispers or himself. The silence that followed felt like a solid wall, pressing against his skull, suffocating him. Nathan's eyes darted around the room, seeking escape. The walls closed in. The temperature in the room dropped so suddenly it took his breath away, his teeth chattering as if he were standing in the middle of an ice storm. He could see his own breath now, each exhale visible, misting the air. The faint remnants of the glass scattered on the floor shimmered, reflecting his panicked face in thousands of jagged, broken pieces. His reflection in the shards was always a little off, just enough to unsettle him, to remind him that he wasn't whole, that he hadn't been whole for a long time. The door. He needed to get out. Nathan stumbled toward it, his legs weak, dragging like lead. The dim light from the hallway filtered through the crack beneath the door, promising something outside of this oppressive nightmare. Something normal. But as his hand touched the doorknob, a sudden burst of dizziness overtook him. His body swayed, his mind threatening to collapse entirely. "No," he whispered, his breath shallow. "Not again. Not this time." The room was spinning faster now. The shadows danced in his peripheral vision, distorting, writhing. They seemed to bend in unnatural angles, stretching across the walls like fingers reaching for him. His pulse quickened in response, panic seizing his chest, pulling the air from his lungs. "Come back to me, Nathan." The voice. Vincent. But the words were different now, too calm, too cold, like the quiet before a storm. Nathan froze, every fiber of his being screaming at him to move, to flee. But his body betrayed him. His legs gave way beneath him, and he crashed to the floor, the sharp pain of his knees connecting with the hard ground grounding him for a moment. He looked up at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on him. The storm inside his mind was rising again. The storm that he had never truly been able to escape. He wasn't sure when it had happened, when the voices had become more than just thoughts. When the blurred line between himself and his tormentors had disappeared, leaving only the fractured remnants of his sanity in their wake. Had he been the one to invite them in? Or had they always been there, waiting, just beneath the surface of his mind? His fingers gripped the edges of the floor as he forced himself to sit up. The quiet had grown more oppressive. More threatening. Each second dragged on, heavy and thick, like molasses. Vincent's voice rang out again, cutting through the silence like a razor. "Do you think you can escape me, Nathan?" It was a low whisper, but it carried with it the weight of 1,000 storms. The words seemed to echo in his skull, vibrating, twisting his mind in on itself. "You can never escape. Not now. Not ever." Nathan's hands trembled. His throat constricted, the sound of his own breath now deafening in his ears. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His mind was fractured beyond repair, splintered into 1,000 different pieces, each one pulling him in a different direction. "Please!" he begged, his voice barely audible. "I just want peace. I don't want this anymore." But the silence, the oppressive silence, answered him with nothing. No comfort. No release. Just the cold, unfeeling embrace of his fractured mind. Then, just as suddenly as the tension had built, it snapped. A sharp, violent crack, like thunder splitting the sky. The storm had broken. But it wasn't Vincent's voice that filled the silence now. It was his own. He stood in the room, staring at himself, the reflection still too distorted to be real, and yet it was. The silence had shattered. Nathan turned away from the broken glass and took a single step backward, his heart pounding in his chest. What had happened? What was real now? The floodgates of his mind had opened, and the chaos was pouring out, overwhelming him, drowning him. Every thought, every feeling, every word that had ever been trapped inside him was rushing to the surface. His fingers tightened around the edges of the doorframe. The handle felt warm beneath his touch. And yet he couldn't open the door. It was locked. Chapter 10. Nathan stared at the reflection in the mirror, his breath ragged as if he were suffocating. The face that stared back at him was his, yet it wasn't. His eyes were hollow, rimmed with dark circles that betrayed sleepless nights spent fighting the storm inside his skull. His features were sharp, angular, and yet somehow blurred, as though a veil of uncertainty had been cast over him, distorting his very being. He looked like a stranger. He raised his trembling hand to touch his face, but the reflection mirrored his movements too precisely, too perfectly. The connection was so deep, so consuming, that it made his stomach lurch. He wanted to look away, to break the gaze, but the reflection held him hostage. It was as though something, or someone, was pulling him into that twisted, warped version of reality. "You've been running from yourself for far too long, Nathan," the voice purred, low and seductive. Vincent's voice. But it wasn't the voice that he recognized. This was something more. Something darker. Nathan's stomach churned. He had to look away. He had to break free. But every time his mind screamed to escape, another voice surfaced, another personality clawing its way to the forefront of his thoughts. Each one of them, demanding to be heard. "Shut up," Nathan muttered, gritting his teeth as he staggered back from the mirror, his mind spiraling into chaos. But it wasn't Vincent's voice he heard next. "Why are you fighting it?" It was a new voice, cold and smooth, with a calculated malice that sent shivers down his spine. He turned quickly, his gaze scanning the room for the source. But there was nothing. Only shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they should. His pulse quickened, the air around him thickening with an invisible pressure. The walls felt as though they were closing in, the space growing smaller with every passing second. His hands pressed against his skull, his fingers digging into his scalp as if he could tear the thoughts from his mind. "Leave me alone," he whispered, the words barely audible. "You can't make us go away," the new voice, this time sharp and unnerving, replied. "We are part of you now. Forever." Nathan stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape the suffocating grip of the voices. But when his hand touched the doorknob, he felt something cold, something unnatural, and he froze. The reflection in the mirror was gone. In its place stood Vincent, his pale, unreadable face staring back at him. "I've waited for this moment, Nathan," Vincent's voice echoed from every corner of the room. It was everywhere, coming from the walls, from the very air that surrounded him. "You've always known. We've always been here, lurking in the dark corners of your mind. Now you can't run. Not anymore." Nathan's heart thudded in his chest as he backed away from the door, his eyes wild, darting between the shadows that now seemed to swirl around him. His vision blurred, his senses overloaded, until he couldn't distinguish reality from delusion. He sank to the floor, his back against the wall, trembling uncontrollably. It was too much. Everything was too much. The voices. The shadows. The suffocating pressure in his mind. He shut his eyes tight, clenching his fists, trying to shut it all out. But when he opened them again, the room was no longer the same. The walls were stretching, warping, their edges blurring like smoke in the air. And the voices, they were louder now. Too loud. Too close. You don't even know which voice is yours anymore, do you, Nathan? The voice was both cruel and mocking, a reflection of the torment that had become his life. "We've taken your reality. We've taken you." Nathan recoiled, his body shaking with fear. His mind was cracking. Splintering. The fragments of his broken psyche now fought for control, and he could feel them, the other personalities, the other voices, all clawing to be heard. It was a battle he couldn't win. There was no escape. "Please," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Please make it stop." But the voices only grew louder. The shadows only deepened. The darkness of his mind had swallowed him whole, and now there was no going back. Chapter 11. The morning light slanted through the blinds, casting long, sickly shadows across the room. Nathan woke to the same oppressive silence, but it wasn't peaceful. The air felt too thick, too still, as though the very room was holding its breath. The walls, once comforting and familiar, now seemed foreign, alien. They pressed in on him, suffocating him with their cold indifference. His chest tightened with anxiety, a familiar weight pressing on his ribcage. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, feeling the cold floor against his bare feet. His mind was an endless storm of jagged thoughts, each one battling to break through the walls of his sanity. But there was something new today. Something that made the voices feel more present, more real. "Good morning, Nathan," came a voice, smooth and warm, like honey dripping from the edges of his mind. It was Vincent's voice. But this time, it was different. It wasn't taunting. It wasn't sinister. It was almost comforting. Nathan froze. He hadn't heard Vincent speak like that in weeks. The warmth in the voice felt wrong. It was too soft, too soothing, like a predator offering shelter to its prey. He tried to push the thought aside, but the more he did, the more the feeling lingered. "You're so close, Nathan," Vincent continued, the voice growing softer, like it was coming from within his own chest. "You know what you need to do. You can't keep pretending." Nathan's pulse quickened, his hands trembling as he stood up. His vision blurred, his mind struggling to stay afloat in the turbulent sea of voices. He knew that this wasn't just a passing thought. This was Vincent. Or at least, it felt like him. The darkness within Nathan's mind had taken root so deep that it was hard to tell which thoughts were his own and which ones belonged to the fractured personalities that now lived inside him. "Stop it," Nathan muttered, his voice barely a whisper. He ran his fingers through his hair, trying to ground himself. He had to focus. He couldn't let the voices take control again. He couldn't let them win. But the more he tried to silence them, the louder they became. "I see you're struggling," another voice, this one sharper and filled with venom, broke through. It was the cold, calculated voice, the one that felt like a shadow creeping into his very soul. "Don't bother. You can't escape yourself." Nathan's head throbbed, the pressure building until his thoughts became a whirlwind of chaos. He staggered to the bathroom, his reflection in the mirror nothing more than a distorted version of himself. His eyes were hollow, sunken, and yet there was a fire in them now, a desperation that burned hotter than before. "Stop looking at yourself like that," the sharp voice hissed from the depths of his mind. "You're a monster! And you know it!" He recoiled, his breath coming in short gasps. The reflection in the mirror flickered, as though it were being distorted by the tension in his mind. A new face stared back at him, Vincent, but not the Vincent he knew. This version was twisted, darker, with eyes that seemed to bore into him with an unnatural hunger. "Do you see what you've become?" The reflection sneered, its voice a harsh mockery of his own. "This is what happens when you let the darkness consume you. You've already crossed the line. You're nothing but a hollow shell now." Nathan turned away from the mirror, his heart racing. He needed to escape. He needed to get out of this place before the voices became too much. He grabbed his jacket and stumbled out the door, feeling the cold air hit him like a slap in the face. The world outside was a blur of motion, the streets shifting in strange, unfamiliar patterns. The buildings seemed to loom over him, their sharp edges twisting and contorting as if the very fabric of reality was bending around him. He staggered down the sidewalk, barely able to keep his balance as the voices inside his mind continued to scream. "You can't outrun this," the cold voice whispered, slithering through his thoughts. "You can't escape from yourself." He stopped in his tracks, staring down at his hands, his palms slick with sweat. His breathing was ragged, the panic rising in his chest like a tidal wave. It was all too much. The voices, the hallucinations, the overwhelming weight of his own fractured mind, it was suffocating him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The wind howled around him, tugging at his clothes, as if the very elements were conspiring against him. He felt the pressure building, the walls closing in once again. His vision began to blur, and he could feel the edges of his reality beginning to unravel. "You're nothing, Nathan," the new voice crooned, sweet and venomous. "You're just a collection of broken pieces, scattered across a shattered world." Nathan stumbled back, his body slamming into the nearest wall as his mind spun further out of control. His fingers curled into fists as he fought to maintain his grip on reality. But it was slipping away. Slowly. Relentlessly. He could feel the weight of the voices pressing down on him, each one dragging him deeper into the abyss. His body trembled with fear, his heart pounding in his chest, but the voices wouldn't stop. They wouldn't let him go. And then, as if from nowhere, the darkness descended fully. The world around him was swallowed by the void, and all that remained were the voices, louder, clearer, more insistent. "You can't save yourself, Nathan," the voices whispered, as one. "You are..." Chapter 12. Nathan stood at the precipice of his existence, the lines between his fractured realities growing thinner by the second. The world around him dissolved into a shifting mass of colors and shadows, a visual kaleidoscope that offered no clarity, no solace. He tried to steady himself against the crumbling brick wall, his fingers scraping against its rough surface, searching for something, anything, to anchor him in the chaos of his mind. But there was nothing. His body trembled violently, the cold air of the night sinking deep into his bones, yet the heat within him refused to fade. His skin prickled as though it was on fire. The voices, oh, the voices, ripped through his thoughts, like jagged shards of glass tearing into the delicate fabric of his consciousness. "You're losing it, Nathan," Vincent's voice cut through the cacophony like a blade. It was calm, too calm, like a predator circling its prey. "I've been waiting for this. For you to fall apart. You always were the weak one, weren't you?" Nathan clutched his head, trying to suppress the onslaught of words that clawed at the edges of his sanity. But no matter how hard he tried, they kept coming, relentless, insistent. It was like being drowned by an ocean of his own making. "You'll never escape us, Nathan," the voice of the cold personality hissed, its tone like nails on a chalkboard. "You're ours. All of you." The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, as though it were no longer solid, no longer something he could trust. His vision wavered, and the city street, once familiar, now appeared alien, like some warped reflection of a life he no longer recognized. The colors bled into one another, swirling in a dizzying, hypnotic dance. He felt himself being drawn deeper into the abyss, unable to resist, unwilling to try. He thought of his family, his mother, his father, his friends, those fleeting glimpses of a normal life that now seemed so distant. A life he would never return to. "Don't think about them," the sharp, venomous voice warned, as if it could sense his thoughts, tracking them like a heat-seeking missile. "They're gone. You're alone now, Nathan. Alone with us." Nathan's breath came in short, desperate gasps. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He was drowning, sinking into a black void where nothing mattered, where no one cared. His body trembled uncontrollably, the voices twisting inside his skull like serpents, coiling and tightening, squeezing the last remnants of his sanity from him. He stumbled backward, barely aware of his surroundings, but the voices, God, the voices, they were too loud now. Too persistent. He could feel them inside him, in his veins, in his bones. They were part of him now, an extension of his being. There was no escape. "Do you hear it, Nathan?" Vincent whispered again, his voice dark and seductive. "It's calling to you. You know what you have to do." Nathan squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his hands against his temples as though trying to block out the deafening sound of his own unraveling. But the words, their words, wouldn't stop. They were inside him, a constant drumbeat that reverberated through every fiber of his existence. "You were always weak," the venomous voice snarled, and Nathan couldn't tell if it was Vincent or someone else now. "Too fragile. Too easy to break." His mind reeled, thoughts shattering into 1,000 pieces as the weight of their words pressed down on him like a suffocating hand. He wasn't sure if he was even standing anymore, or if he had collapsed into the darkness. Everything had become one twisted blur. Then, a new voice emerged from the void, a voice soft and sweet, almost a lullaby. "You can make it stop, Nathan. Just let go. Don't you want peace?" For a moment, the world seemed to pause, like a brief interlude in an otherwise endless nightmare. The voice was calm, soothing in a way that made him feel less like a man torn apart by his own mind and more like a helpless child seeking solace. But even that feeling quickly soured. "Let go," it repeated, the whisper curling around his thoughts like a serpent's hiss. "Let go of the pain. Let go of the fight." He didn't even know which personality was speaking anymore. Maybe they were all speaking together, merging into one all-encompassing voice, pulling him further and further into the abyss. The weight of their words was crushing him, and the idea of release, the promise of an end to the torment, was growing increasingly tempting. The darkness that waited at the edge of his mind felt almost like an old friend now, one he could finally embrace without resistance. "I can't," he choked, his voice weak and broken. "I don't want to die." But even as the words left his mouth, part of him wondered if he was lying to himself. Did he truly not want it? The thought of peace, sweet, eternal peace, was an idea that grew stronger with each passing moment. He could almost feel the cold embrace of it, beckoning him to surrender. To stop fighting. But just as he was about to give in, to surrender to the sweet release that called to him like an invitation to oblivion, the voices erupted again. "No!" Vincent screamed, his tone shifting from calm to frantic, as though Nathan's hesitation had caught him off guard. "You're not done yet! You can't leave us! We won't let you go!" The voices collided, crashing into one another, their dissonance filling his head like a violent symphony. For a moment, Nathan thought his mind would simply implode under the pressure, but then, amid the chaos, a single thought broke through, a desperate, fleeting thought that felt more like a plea than a decision. "I'm not ready to die yet." It wasn't a strong thought, not even a clear one, but it was enough. Enough to keep him tethered to reality, if only for a little longer. His vision swam again, and he could barely focus on the scene in front of him, the dark street fading into shadows. His hands trembled as he pressed them against his face, trying to block out the voices. The torment, the fear, they were all too much. But as the darkness closed in once more, one thing became painfully clear. There was no escape from this. He was caught in the trap of his own mind. Chapter 13. Nathan stood at the edge of his existence, his mind a broken, tattered shell of the person he once was. The voices were louder now, a choir of dissonance and decay, each one vying for dominance, each one tearing at his fragile grip on reality. The world around him had long since dissolved into a blur of shifting shapes and colors, leaving him adrift in a sea of unrelenting madness. His hands were trembling, bloodshot eyes darting from side to side as he struggled to understand the fragments of his fractured thoughts. His chest tightened with every breath, as though the air itself were turning against him, suffocating him from within. "You're still here, Nathan?" Vincent's voice was mocking, amused. "Pathetic! You thought you could escape us. But we are you, Nathan. We are your truth." Nathan clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms. The pressure in his skull was unbearable, his head a war zone of warring personalities, each one waging a battle for control. "You can't run anymore," the cold voice purred, its words like icy daggers. "You think you're safe, but you're not. You're trapped in your own, and there's no one to save you. You'll never escape us." He gasped for air, the words echoing through his skull like the reverberation of an ancient bell, its toll ringing with finality. I don't want to listen anymore," Nathan whispered, his voice shaking. His body was numb, cold to the touch, as if all the warmth had been sucked out of him, leaving only the hollow ache of despair. But the voices didn't stop. They never stopped. The sweet, seductive voice of the comforting one, a personality that had always tried to lull him into submission, whispered in his ear like a lover's caress. "It's okay, Nathan. You don't have to fight anymore. Just let go. Close your eyes. You'll never hurt again. We'll be here for you. Always." Nathan felt his mind slip further into darkness, the weight of their words pressing him deeper into the chasm of despair. There was no escape, no light to guide him out of this endless night. All that was left was the void, the abyss that had been calling to him for so long. For a moment, he allowed himself to close his eyes, his heart hammering in his chest. But even as he did, something in the deepest recesses of his consciousness screamed out, a faint, almost imperceptible cry for help. It was a part of him, a part that had always fought to live, fought to stay sane. "No," he whispered hoarsely. "Not yet. Not like this." But the darkness was insistent. It clawed at him with unseen fingers, dragging him toward the edge, pushing him closer to the end. Suddenly, a voice, harsh, guttural, and filled with malice, rose above the rest, a cold command that shattered everything. "Die, Nathan! It's time!" The final voice, the one that had always been the most vicious, the most relentless, spoke with a venomous certainty. It was the voice of death itself, the voice that had been growing in strength with each passing day, its influence spreading like a cancer. Nathan stumbled, his knees buckling beneath him as he gasped for breath. The air was thick, stifling, and every inhalation felt like an effort too monumental to sustain. His mind swirled, drowning in a sea of confusion, pain, and unrelenting terror. But then, amidst the chaotic symphony of voices, he saw it. A vision? Or was it a flicker of something, faint, distant, and impossible to grasp, moved across his consciousness? It was a memory. A flash of a time when he was whole, when the world made sense, when the voices hadn't consumed him. His mother's smile. A distant laughter. A moment of fleeting happiness. The vision was so quick, so fragile, that it slipped through his fingers like water through a sieve. And yet, in that brief moment, Nathan remembered something that no voice could take away from him: he had been loved. There had been a time when he had felt human, when the world had felt real. But that was before. Now, he was just the sum of his broken parts, a fractured collection of voices and despair. With trembling hands, Nathan reached for the one thing that had always remained a constant in his mind, his only means of control. The blade. It had been buried deep in his pocket, hidden away like a dirty secret, a promise he had made to himself. A promise that, when the time came, he would be the one to end it. His fingers closed around the cold metal, the familiar weight of it grounding him in this final, painful reality. For a moment, he hesitated, the voices swirling around him like a storm, urging him to let go, to surrender. But this was the moment. The only one that truly mattered. With a trembling hand, Nathan brought the blade to his wrist, the sharp edge pressing into his skin. The voices screamed in unison, but it was too late now. The world had faded away, and there was only him, only his decision. The darkness engulfed him as the blade sank deeper into his flesh, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Complete, empty silence. The last vestiges of his existence slipped away as the blood poured from his body, a slow, inevitable trickle that marked the end of his suffering. As Nathan fell to the ground, his vision blurred, the world spinning and collapsing around him. The voices had finally gone quiet. The torment was over. But even in that final moment, just before everything turned to black, a single thought crossed his mind. I'm free. The end.